We've been hearing for years that Russia and China are best friends, building this massive alliance as total equals. But what if that's really a myth? What if China isn't acting like a partner of Russia at all, but instead it's acting like the boss, calling the shots, buying up influence, and treating Russia like its own personal gas station? Today we need to talk about something a lot of people are ignoring. Is China quietly taking over Russia? Howdy, howdy, friends. We are talking China today, and I have invited a guest to Inside Russia today, a good friend, Pyotr Kurzin, the host of the Global Gambit YouTube channel. Pyotr has spent years working across Africa and Eastern Europe with the World Bank and the International Crisis Group. Pyotr is trained in strategic studies and economic statecraft, if I pronounce it right. This isn't second-hand commentary. This is first-hand field and policy coming from Pyotr. Pyotr, welcome to Inside Russia.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Konstantin, and to be switching roles for the first time, I think.
Yes, we are switching role because this is my first ever interview here at Inside Russia. I have been a guest at many medias and TV channels, TV programs, and YouTube channels, and I am a regular at your channel, Pyotr. That's the Pyotr Kurzin Geopolitics, the Global Gambit. And I'm going to place a link in the description of this video and in the pinned comment. So everyone, please check out the channel of Pyotr. Very interesting material there. And we do conversations at Pyotr's channel about once a month or so. So it's time to go to Inside Russia and time to talk to Pyotr about China. It's fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you for joining. And I know that you are an expert in geopolitics. You're a master interviewer. I'm not. This is something very new for me. Okay. Let's try something new.
No, I think you're doing a great job. I would just add to your very warm introduction that I am half Russian as well. People who know you might recognize the name. And, I was born in the UK, but I spent a fair amount of time in Russia. So I was born out of the end of the Cold War. My parents met in 1981, and then they weren't able to be together properly until 1990 or the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I owe a lot of my interests, I think, or just existence to sort of some big geopolitical forces, and I think that's what stimulates my interest in economics, international relations, history, and why we've, I think, had some great conversations about what happens inside Russia, but be it on the economy, about Putin's inner circle, Russian foreign policy. During my time in Africa, for example, I became very interested in the way that great powers, including, well, you might not say any more great powers, but Russia is trying to be a big influencer on the continent of Africa. So these things have definitely interested me, and obviously when we talk about great power competition or great power politics more broadly, the Chinese-Russian relationship, Sino-Russo relationship is a cornerstone of that. So I'm interested to get into this conversation with you.
Excellent. I was thinking of structuring our today's conversation in the following way. I have two major topics to talk about and a few questions about these topics. My first topic is China really Russia's partner, or has Russia become dependent on China? Okay, what is the current status of this relationship between the two neighbors? And the second block of questions is if Russia is dependent on China right now, in your opinion, what does it mean for Russia, for its sovereignty, for its economy, and for its future? What do you think?
Well, I mean, we can start with maybe the first theme question. I can share
Yes,
some
yes, yes,
initial remarks.
absolutely, absolutely. I have a few questions, and then you are welcome to add to what you know best. I'm thinking of this. We talk about live for 40 minutes or so, and then I turn on a live stream chat that live audience can ask us questions. We have a moderation team on standby, the best moderation team on internet, and I warned them about this interview, and they will make sure that the chat is civil, nice, pleasant, as always. Okay, so what do you think? Shall we start?
Yeah, let's get into it. I mean, I could just dive into it, or is there a specific angle or question you wanted to put forward first?
Okay, okay. So I was thinking my first question is how should we really understand the current China Russia relationship? Is it an alliance or convenience or asymmetrical dependency?
No, it's certainly not symmetrical dependency. Um, the relationship between the Russians and the Chinese is heavily steeped in the historical context, the ideological sort of views of the world. We can go back many decades or centuries if you want, but essentially the relationship is in its modern day form is a strategic partnership and quite a comprehensive one. On my channel, because I'm quite interested in the theories of international relations, people often just use alliance or partnership or defense pact or coalition interchangeably, but these are not the same thing. They are, and a strategic partnership is a more limited version of an alliance. You don't have a joint declaration of defense or something, right? A defense pact is but a component of an alliance. The NATO alliance is obviously the most infamous and comprehensive one of its kind. So, in a strategic partnership, these are primarily around interests, but they are constrained by asymmetric asymmetries. So it's not purely transactional. There is some overlap in vision, in that they want a more balanced world or multipolar world. I'm not going to exactly define what that is yet, because we can come to it later. But they operate in a mutually beneficial alignment against Western or specific United States dominance. So I think if we start from the post World War II period, that gives us a clear idea that you can go further back. I can give you a couple of examples which undermine the longest standing relationship. So there's the Treaty of Kulja, which was established in 1851, when the Russians basically gained access to trade in areas in Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs, or in the very northwest of China. Then you can talk about the Treaty of Peking in 1860, when China ceded large swathes of its northeastern territory to Russia. And then more
Manchuria.
recently, yes, well, to an extent, we can talk about the specific Soviet-Sino border clashes over the 60s, right, 68, 69. These are demonstrations of the inherent distrust that the Chinese have for the Russians, or more historically, the Soviets. And over that time, you will hear people often talk about it, and I'm sure some of your viewers will know this, the big partner, small partner, senior partner, junior partner. And for much of that time, the Soviets were the senior partner for the Cold War. And Mao, in the early part of the Cold War, was relatively on board. But then you had the deviation after the border clashes, where China decided to go off and do more of its own thing. This obviously came with the Great Leap Forward and the some terrible economic policies that the CCP implemented, which wreaked havoc on the economy and rural areas of China. And in this case, the Soviets decided to get closer with India. So that has also undermined the long-standing relationship. If you talk to a lot of Russians, actually, those who are historically minded will say that they feel that the bilateral relationship between India and Russia is more natural, maybe not bigger or fruitful, but more natural than the Chinese-Russian relationship. And so you then have to bring this into modern day. In the time that Russia has been not really growing that much at all, right? If I think about growth that the Russian economy has been doing compared to China's, it's not really been very consistent. China's has ballooned, whilst China's has largely flatlined. I don't know. I'm looking at a graph here just to bring up for example, right? So the Chinese officially overtook Russia in around 1991, 92. And then at that point, they were very marginally similar in terms of trillions of dollars in terms of GDP. But then after 2005, China's economy begins to go like this and then continues to just escalate. They had double growth figures for many of those years. Russia's never really did well. They benefited from an oil boom during the noughties or 2000s, but then they were hit badly by 2008 and the financial crisis. But of course, the Georgian War, and then sanctions, which they reached a peak of around $2.5 trillion in nominal GDP. And then it begins to seep off into 2015, where it's more like more what it is now. And it hasn't really changed since, whilst China's has just grown and grown. So in the time that China has been a economic leviathan, Russia has never reached its full potential through some of its own decisions, through the exogenous factors like sanctions, poor energy prices and markets, because a lot of Russia's entire dependency is on energy exports, which is why right now the war in Iran is so beneficial for the Kremlin and the war in Ukraine. So, and then the last point I would just say is simply the ideological outlook that the Chinese and the Russians have adopted. So over the time that Putin has been in power, he's had largely a consistent idea that he wants to make Russia relevant. He wants to ensure that Russia is a great power. He wants to reacquire through forcible acquisition or coercive diplomacy things that he believes are Russian. China, on the other hand, has shifted. In the 2000s, it was relatively on Hu Jintao, it was relatively constructive. And this reached a peak in 2008 when they hosted the Olympic Games, where a lot of people recognized the symbolism that China was here. China is a big power now. The world is going to be around, America, China, and sort of everyone else, sort of, going in between those two great powers, maybe. But since President Xi Jinping took over, there's been a major shift. Now, it's also shifted subsequently since COVID, but throughout much of the 2010s, Chinese foreign policy became a lot more assertive. They wanted to be a lot more dominant in their sphere abroad, their interests. This was what known as wolf warrior diplomacy, the Belt and Road Initiative, these sorts of things, which, if you look at them in a more isolated way, you can recognize that they quite badly conflict with Russia's interests. And the final point I would just say simply is that in 2023, China released a very provocative map, which was showing what China recognizes as its territorial integrity or its state. And of course, there was a little bit of Manchuria that was in this greater China absorbed back into China. And Russia never said anything. So it shows you the disparity and the way that the balance of power has shifted, especially since the end of the Cold War.
Now, thank you so very much. It's certainly a very comprehensive description. And I do remember how the Chinese released these maps. And it wasn't just one map. As far as I understand, throughout China, it's the official set of maps. They go to schools, to universities, and so forth. And I actually covered it in my broadcasts. And I also mentioned that Russia's reaction, well, there was none. And it is one of those little signs that show the current status quo. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but this is what I think. Things like that show that relationship is not equal. Relationship of dependency, because if Russia doesn't respond in any way, it shows that it does not feel confident, it feels weaker, and it feels dependent on China for some things.
Yeah, absolutely. In international relations, again, there's something called over-dependency, right? Or over-reliance. And in many ways, again, the other thing that I think we should always keep in mind when we're talking about this is how much the personal visions of the world by the leaders themselves influence the overall foreign policy. Autocratic states like China in its one-party system, or in a hybrid regime, as we call it in Russia. I mean, it's a autocratic regime, but Putin, they have elections, so people try to say it's an illiberal democracy, right? Because the elections are already predetermined, but because they still have elections, it's under the guise of a democracy, but it isn't, right? Hungary is a lighter version, or Turkey is a lighter version of what Putin has done with Russia, but they're not China because they don't have it's not a one-party state system. So I think that the personal views of Putin and Xi, if we're focusing on post 2012, are incredibly important in how they see each other, and therefore how willing they are to go in terms of integrating their economies, depending upon energy, trade, information, military exchange, whatever it is. I think that over time, these two have become a lot closer. Putin didn't have a very close relationship with Hu Jintao, Xi's predecessor, because Hu Jintao was more moderate. He was softer. He was more constructive with the West. And then after 2008 and the financial crisis, and then the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, which China was greatly benefiting from in the subsequent years, that's obviously shifted. And I think that Putin has been, the dependency has grown because as Russia has undertaken its interference, if you like, revisionist. Both countries are revisionist. I'll take a step back, right? They both want to revise history to better suit or adhere to their preferences of the world and their country's place in it. But the difference is that Russia is revanchist as well. Russia is willing to take those physical steps to ensure that its revisionist sense of history is achieved. China's not like that. China always emphasizes non-interference, territorial integrity. And while viewers may watch that and be like, well, that's absurd, that's what they do. And they have their own version of economic interference, right? This whole idea of debt diplomacy. And that happens with Moscow as well. Russia's over-reliance on China has meant that parts of Eastern Russia are being bought up by private Chinese firms. And then they control the water supply. One example I have that I think is not very well known is around Lake Baikal in the far eastern part of Russia. And this entire water security, huge water security for Russia, is largely controlled by Chinese companies. And the idea that they're not invading through military terms, but they're buying up the right assets, they're buying up the right things, and therefore they sort of effectively control it.
Expansion.
Essentially, yes. And so this dependency, a lot of people look at the dependency and think about, China's dependency on Russian energy. I mean, yeah, China does get a lot of energy from Russia, but we know how much they've been investing in renewables and trying to decouple or de-risk themselves. And that's the case with the Middle East right now. China is vulnerable, but they're certainly not as vulnerable as some other countries. And this emphasis that sort of China is really seeking Iran to not escalate, I think it's not true. What the Chinese fear most is ideological contagion. The idea that the pushing back or eradication of a regime like the Islamic Republic can somehow be trickled down into the CCP. We saw that with the white paper revolution, as it's called in the West, when in COVID in 22 there were a lot of Chinese that came out, especially in northwestern China, in protest of COVID policies. So China is quite dependent on Russia in certain ways through military intelligence and energy. But it's far, far more, as I think will be pretty obvious to most people, skewed to the Russians' dependence on China. For example, 2% of China's trade comes from Russia. This is in 2020. And now I think it's about 1.5 versus Russia's, which was 18%. So 10 times, almost a fifth of Russia's entire trade is with China. So I think it's pretty clear who's more dependent on who.
Well, I can tell you, as an expert on Russia, I can tell you that Russia depends on China much more than China depends on Russia. China is shaking off dependence on Russia for energy. For example, they have stopped buying Russian coal completely, and right now we're seeing that the coal mining industry is it's stopped working. Okay, 2/3 of coal mines are closing down or have closed already, and the Chinese are doing a great deal of switching to renewable energy sources, and that's literally last 3-year development. Russia, they're still buying Russian oil and a great deal of it, and Russian gas, natural gas. But now it's not a partnership. It's not a trading partnership. It's more of a blackmail, because China is the only customer for natural gas left for Russia, and they can demand any prices they want. Okay, and then they've gone as far in Russia as made it classified the prices of at which they sell natural gas to the Chinese, and they just give the volumes. Oh, we sold so much gas to China, but how much did you get? Well, that's classified. And definitely
Yeah,
China.
and I think that
Yeah.
I think that. Sorry, you froze for me there briefly. No, I think that's very much the case, right? And we can look to a recent example viewers might remember in the news. Trump threatened secondary sanctions. Now, when you introduced me at the beginning, economic statecraft is essentially how countries utilize their economies to influence state behavior. So sanctions are the most obvious one, but there's another one, tariffs. Trump has leveraged tariffs, not so much because they are great for economic potential, but because they are a negotiating tool. There's a concept called anchoring, which Trump likes to utilize, but the Chinese have as well with the Russians, actually, which is that if you think of the Siberia 2 pipeline, or in the case of Trump's negotiations with Europe over whatever, he positions himself very far to the right of an issue or whatever, on the extreme. And that makes everyone freak out that the thing's going to escalate, et cetera, et cetera. And then he actually comes forward with a compromise. And therefore, because people have been so stunned and freaking out about this extreme version, they're more likely to accept the compromise. So when Trump is threatening secondary sanctions, for example, on the Chinese or the Indian economy, well, both countries immediately capitulated or greatly reduced their reliance. And that's the worst thing for Moscow, because Russia, I am half Russian, obviously. We're both from the country, so we want to see the country as a constructive player. But right now, because of Putin's overemphasis in the energy sector, he's actually undermined Russia's ability to diversify the economy. Russia used to be a leader in many areas of R&D and advanced tech and science and innovation. And it's fallen by the wayside because of the overemphasis on oil. And so when countries are no longer really needing much energy, Russia's relevance really does lose quite a lot. So I think for this, like, Russia needs to make more concerted effort to diversify, but that's not something you can rely on with China, because China is shifting its own policies. And this comes to something that I do want to raise in a moment, but I wanted to make sure we're staying on track with the questions.
Yes. Well, all right. Thank you. Let's touch the second block of questions. Basically, I'd like to ask you about the future of the relationship between Russia and China. Where do you see the trend is pointing to?
That's a speculative question to answer.
It is, but hey, that's okay.
No,
I'm not gonna hold you responsible to that. I just want your opinion.
No, of course. I mean, I try to base my opinion on substance, fact, empirical evidence as much as emotional preference, right? I would like, as I said just a minute ago, for Russia to be a constructive player, but right now I find that difficult to imagine with Putin in the picture and broadly the entire mental outlook of a lot of Russians and the state itself, right? A lot has to change. But I think it's also more dependent upon what does China actually want? This is a question that a lot of academics, a lot of China watchers, of which I'm not explicitly one, I look at China through the lens of great power politics. How is China behaving, operating in the context of what the Russians, the Americans, the EU are doing or saying, etc. So the specific question is, what is China after? What does it want from the international system? Does it want to be what's known as a status quo power, benefit from the system as it is, which it has done for the best part of 40 years? Does it want to be a country that relatively just rides along? And we can see this demonstrated in the fact that magazines like The Economist will depict what's known as the axis of upheaval: Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. Three of those countries, relatively in similar mindset, right? They're all state sponsors of terrorance or designated as such. They're all seen as more proxy or not proxy, pariah states or rogue states. These are all very Western interpretations for those watching. This is how the West sees them, or Western policymakers would define it. So it's not necessarily completely accurate. But the point is that the fourth one, China, is very different from that. Yes, they have a strategic partnership with the Russians, but it's not as comprehensive as the Iranians. And I would argue quite strongly that the closest relationship isn't the Chinese-Russian, it's the Iranian-Russian, because of the depth by which they've been operating. Yes, okay, the Russians are economically close with the Chinese, but ideologically speaking, they're more overlapping with the Iranians because of the extent they're both willing to go to disrupt or be physically, militarily involved with one another or against the West or whatever, right? Russia's providing intelligence to Iran, it seems, right now. China isn't doing that. They're just saying to Iran, we want your oil. China doesn't really care where it gets its energy from as long as it gets it. But that's point number one, which is China a status quo power? It just wants to continue with the system as it is, and it doesn't welcome these disruptions from the other three, or Russians. And it goes back to that non-interference thing I mentioned earlier. Second, though, is China a global hegemon? Does it want to become the leader of the international system, to usurp, as we hear this word often, the United States? I mean, there are some indications to argue that fact. They've spent years, coercing, incentivizing countries in the UN to stop recognizing Taiwan. When you've seen a reduction of the amount of countries that recognize Taiwan from around 10 years ago, to around 15, 14 now. So clearly China wants to be seen as a major player. And in many ways, what Trump is doing, not just in Iran, but overall with the West relationship, transatlantic relationship, economic policy with tariffs, that's all benefiting China because they don't have to do anything. China just has to sit back and allow Trump to take a hammer to the system that has benefited the United States for many a decade. So there's that. Or there's a third argument, which is sort of a subset, but it is simply, does China just want to be a regional player, a global, absolute dominant over its over what the Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasties of the millennium? Does it just want to be the de facto, unquestionable power in that part of the world, like Russia wants to sort of be in Europe? This whole idea of, Putin has Europe, China has Asia, Trump has Americas, right? This sort of concept. So there's a lot of competing ideas and theories around what it is China wants and how the CCP operates in that regard. Because Xi Jinping is a unique person. He has centralized control in China in a way that we've never seen before. And in many ways, that is something that has appealed to Putin a lot, because it means he has a bedrock person who he can rely on.
His core model.
And the two, Yeah, an effective role model, and we see how close their relationship when they joke about living forever or to 150 years, as you may have heard them accidentally. I'm still skeptical about that on the mics a few months back. So I think that where it's going is largely dependent on China's desires, because ultimately Russia is reactionary. They are reacting to what China does because they don't have as much of a hand in it. Can Putin still throw his weight around and get angry, threaten nuclear warfare? Of course he can. And that's why we can't ever, I think, fully ignore Russia. But it's certainly not the economy global player that China is. Of all the interviews I ever have, right, Constantine, on my channel, almost inevitably by the end of the show, will somehow China about a question about China will come in, or a reference to China will always be in. Russia's not always the case. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how I look at it.
Yes, it does. So basically, you give different pathways, and depending on which China chooses, and that's a big question actually. Then the future will unfold for relationship between China and Russia. Now, tell me this: there's a very simplistic understanding in Russia. Every Russian is geopolitical expert of enormous magnitude. Okay, that's what they think, and there's a very simplistic, very strong opinion that China wants Russia's resources and Russia's land. Manchuria, it wants to take Manchuria back. It wants water, Baikal, and I mentioned what you said about Baikal being taken over by not the entire, lake, but there are some areas that definitely have been leased out to the Chinese, and then they're using the resources, they're using water and so forth. So that's the very simplistic view of the situation. Now, what would you say about that? Does China really want Russian resources just in a very raw way? To get in, grab it, use it, steal it, take it, whatever, and take the land back. Is this
Yeah.
is it possible at all?
Well, I mean, theoretically it is, yes. I think that this again is, I hope your audience are going to allow me to go on a slight tangent for a moment, but I think this comes down to a few factors. The idea of a Russian-Chinese physical clash over territory is something that fascinates a lot of people, including myself, because we know what happened the last time the Russians had a significant war in the East against the Japanese Empire. Well, they were beaten badly. So the Russians, or the Korean War, right? That was a complicated one for the Soviets, and then the Chinese come in. But that's the key point here. One of the key points. We don't know the capacity and competency of the Chinese military. Now, that's not to say that they don't have any, right? They have a standing army of 2 to 3 million. I think it's second only to McDonald's workforce and North Korea. In case you're interested, people, McDonald's is one of the biggest. Yeah, any fun fact. But no, I think it depends on how capable the Chinese military are. They haven't theoretically really been in a large-scale conflict since the 60s with the Indians. So they are building a lot of maritime assets. They are investing a lot in AI and advanced tech. They have a lot of precious minerals and metals and things like that, which are always important. But in terms of actual combat to combat, they haven't had it for a long time. The Russians have. And that's why the comparative advantage the Russians have for the Chinese is military experience and intelligence. So the FSB are still incredibly important to the PLA, or People's Liberation Army, and internal intelligence services of China. So that's one thing, which is if we were to see some kind of escalation between these two over resources, we don't really know how the Chinese would cope. But equally, we don't know what the status of the Russian military would be, right? Putin is all in on Ukraine. He's getting some relief now from this prices of oil and long-term energy situation. But the Russian economy is geared entirely around a war that it is not winning. It is maintaining, if you want to find a word that isn't just saying it's losing, but it's not doing well, right? We all thought it would steamroll the Ukraine and that would be the end of it. So this prognosis, this concept that Russia was the second most powerful military in the world, it was
No more.
exposed for the reality it is. Yeah. So and then it just comes back down to geography. Russia is massive. To move all your units or a sizable amount of your military to the Far East, that's not going to be done quickly. I mean, China's not exactly in the position either. They have more military assets because of North Korea and their concerns about that. But the point is that the Chinese could theoretically really launch a incursion into southern eastern Russia and not really receive any pushback at all. I mean, this is happening already. People are squatting on Russian land. The Russians are aware of it. Putin said this in a statement just last year. Again, he said it 3 years ago. And we look forward to nurturing and broadening our relationship with China and Beijing, and hope that we can resolve, minor issues as well, such as, territorial concerns, which is obviously about the insecurities on the southern flank. Russia's influence over the stands as well, which is another area that you could see contestation, if that's a word. In the past, the Asian, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all that. So in 2000, more than 70% of trade, specifically like, for example, Tajikistan, was with Russia. And now that's shifted to, or Turkmenistan was around 50% was just with Russia, right? Russia was it was undisputably Russia's backyard. Now it's completely flipped round. It's give or take. They're pretty on par. But Turkmenistan, which is one of the unique countries, absolutely much more with China. So Russia faces a significant security concern, not in a traditional sense of its west and east, west and southwest, right, where it's used to with NATO encroachment and all that sort of stuff, but actually from its southeast with China, because China again doesn't need to necessarily leverage military methods. It can just take over countries and push the Russians out economically, which they're effectively doing. Anyway,
well, I can give you a couple first-hand experiences on that. It's been going on for quite some time. I worked for a company, large construction corporation that built power facilities in 3 countries, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And then we ventured into other markets, such as Uzbekistan for small projects, Mongolia, and I faced the Chinese every single time. I remember incredibly sweet payment conditions and prices that the Chinese were giving to the Kazakhs. They were bidding against us to construct large 500 kV substations, and the prices they were giving to the customer were 30-40% less, lower than we could ever give. Okay, and they were trying to push us out very softly, economically, and they eventually did. First it was Kazakhstan. Now I am currently in Uzbekistan. Guess how many Russian investors in this country? 0. Lots of construction going on, lots of residential high-rises, new Tashkent, entire city for 3 million people is being built, big stadiums, social infrastructure facilities, universities. The Chinese, a little bit Turkish, a little bit Saudi Arabians, but that's mostly Chinese. They bring in their money, the investments, they bring in technology, and even people. Okay, so Uzbekistan, Russia's been pushed out of Uzbekistan. Same is going on with Mongolia. That's not really a former Soviet country, but somewhere in the orbit, So I second that. I see that's happening in post-Soviet world, and Russia is not losing; it has lost. Russia cannot offer anything economically, and basically it's been pushed out.
No, 100%. If I can just tag on one last quick point to that, the Chinese imports from the central stand states in 2000 were 1/4 of Russians. but 20, 25 years later, they're more than double what Russian imports now. So, or what their countries import from Russia. And as you say, they've largely been pushed out entirely. But the other thing is the Chinese have an idiom. There's an old idiom known as one mountain cannot tolerate two tigers. And I find this applicable very much in an area which is very mountainous, spanning all the way to the Far East. We're talking about central Siberia or south part of Siberia, all the way to the Far East. Now, there's speculation, obviously, you know, would Russia, if it loses the war, absolutely, does it fragment and break up? And personally, I would not like that. But keeping aside my personal preferences, objectively speaking, I don't think the Chinese would really welcome that. This idea of the status quo power again. You know, China appreciates relative stability, minimal disruption, which is why it really actually doesn't like North Korea at all, despite how dependent North Korea is on. Because they're flying rockets all the time into the Japan or Eastern Asia region, it's a real headache for Beijing. But there's another area, the Arctic. In 2018, on a white paper, which is a sort of broader governmental paper, China termed itself a near-Arctic power, which for anyone watching obviously sounds rather absurd given the proximity of China to the Arctic. But naturally, this is about a vision of what's known as a polar Silk Road to complement broader Belt and Road Initiative that President Xi introduced in 2013. Moscow was very opposed to China joining this the Arctic Council, which is a sort of collection of countries, about 8 or 9, that look at it. And Russia has tried quite a lot to block Chinese research vessels or icebreakers or anything like that. So more that ice caps melt, the more China will be looking to control, exploit, influence activities in northern shipping lanes, what NATO calls the High North. That's really going to be, I think that will be one of the biggest dividers for Russian-Chinese relations.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, well, Pyotr, you know, I have quite a few questions to ask, but I also would really like to introduce the audience into our conversation and turn live stream chat on. I usually structure my live streams, you know, first I deliver a message and then I discuss it with the audience live. And I would like to do that. What I suggest we do is you come back sometimes in the future and we'll continue, perhaps on China, perhaps on something that we'll find significant at the moment. So would you be willing to go ahead and jump into the live discussion?
I'm sure some people are going to say he's talking nonsense. The Chinese and Russians are super close or something. No, I'm definitely curious to hear what others have.
Well, I certainly don't think that you are speaking nonsense. I value your opinion, and I understand that, you know, Chinese and Russians are not friends, yeah, to say the least. So let me turn the live stream chat on. And as I mentioned previously, we have the best moderation team that is taking care of things. So we don't have to look for trolls and ban them and see the comments. The rules are very simple. We do not discuss U.S. politics because every time someone introduces, or sometimes I did in the past, introduce something from U.S. politics, this live stream chat will just explode with different opinions. So everyone, please be nice to each other. No insults, English only, and that's pretty much it. Stay civil and normal. Thank you very much for coming. I see Lorna and Mami K, Amir, Bob S, and Harry is probably lurking somewhere. Thank you for coming, friends. It's fantastic to see you. A couple reminders. First, if you want us to see your messages or questions, then please put them in all caps so it's more visible, and put inside Russia after that sign so it gets highlighted in large orange box. Much easier for me to see, just like Cabin John did. Thank you very much for coming, and I would like to thank everyone for being with us today. It's absolutely fantastic. Pyotr and the audience and the mods, if you have questions to Pyotr, mostly Pyotr probably because it's not often that I have a guest on this channel. It's actually the first time. So if you have any questions, then let me be the moderator of the questions and take them. Okay. Cabin John, thank you for warm words. The usual suspects. We have, Pyotr, just for you, we have a certain number of people who I call the usual suspects of Inside Russia. That's return visitors and not just viewers, but members of Inside Russia community. Then we have the pillars of Inside Russia and the gems. Okay, so the three categories of the supporters. So, howdy, friends, again.
Yeah, no,
I have what's that?
No, I was just going to say I recognize some people on the stream here in the comments from the channel because we've had you on quite a few times. So it's nice to see some, familiar faces, right? Yeah, I think it's pretty nuts. There's a lot of misunderstanding about China and Russia, and I think it's good to be having this conversation, and hopefully people have, taken something away from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first question I see jumps into me is that from Jesteri. Do you think that water is going to be the new oil? Pyotr, what do you think?
Well, I think there's definitely truth to that. If you look at what the Chinese and the Russians have been doing in Africa, for my fieldwork days, I recall that there was a lot of particular investment or interest in not resources that we sort of take for granted, but are absolutely the corner of it. Water scarcity, particularly in the Horn or drier areas, is paramount. The Chinese have been getting a lot of interest around the Sahara Desert, and Sudan is somewhere that the Russians have been interested in building a military base because they want immediate access there. But because of all of that, the water scarcity, if the Russians and the Chinese can control sort of water provision down there, then they have control over it as well. But it also comes back to what we said about Lake Baikal. Russia is abundant with resources, but they don't have the capacity to secure it all, to protect it all. And China is right down the road. They have the people, they have the numbers, they have the resources to... I think we're already seeing, if you want, maybe not a physical war, but a political or economic warfare over things like water, because of the way that the Chinese are going about trying to control these routes, trying to control the supply. If you can control the supply, then you can, have the demand. It's simple economics, and there's very little that the Russians can do.
Thank you very much.
What do you think?
Thank you.
What's your thought?
Well, it depends on how scarce water as resource becomes. We're not there yet. Okay. Water will never become new oil, right? Because you can't compare the two substances, two resources. Okay, but there will definitely be competition for water, for drinking water, and we don't really think of the factor of new technologies might bring us a lot of freshly made drinking water. Desalinized.
Desalinization.
Yeah, something like that. So, but anyway, I think there will be
a tricky word to say.
Yeah,
it's a very tricky word.
Yeah, there will be. It's not going to become new oil, but there will be competition for drinking water. Okay, that's what I think. Now, good question, L. Guard. Do you think Chinese business model is even sustainable? Do they reach break-even point, or do they count on everlasting growth? Would you like to answer that?
Before I get that, yeah, I mean that's a tricky question to answer because I'm not sure what they mean by business model. Do they mean on a micro level or the whole macro economy?
I think more of a macroeconomy, micro level. I mean, what is there to discuss? as companies open, and then they create products, and then they sell, export, and if they earn profit, that sustainable model. Okay, and it's always, any business is only for a certain period of time. So they've been
True.
sustainable for what, 20, 30 years now?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say quickly on the water security front, just one more point, but it also leads into what I'll mention now. Demographics. We haven't talked about demography enough, and my undergraduate was demography, and I spent a lot of time looking at the, declining population of certain places. Eastern Europe and Russia have a particularly high depopulation. Um, Total fertility rate, or the amount of children that a woman can have in their lifetime, right? It has to be over 2.1. Demography is all about statistics. You might be like, why 2.1 of a child? But it's the thing. They have to be over that number to sustain the population. But not only are we seeing depopulation, but we're seeing aging population. And Russia has it bad, but not as bad as Ukraine. But China also has it bad, and in some ways even worse, because of the one-child policy in the 20th century wreaked havoc on the economic imbalance, or the demographic imbalance of the country. For every 100 women, you have 120 men, right? You have a fifth more men because of families' preferences for men during that time. So demographic concerns, older aging population, the growing, what's known as the economic dependency ratio. So the amount of people who are dependent on the working population. Well, if you've got a higher aging population, but a lower overall working population, let alone a younger population who's also reliant on you, the amount of squeeze on the people who have to provide money for the services that can take care of the old one is a problem. So this comes into what we're talking about with businesses. China's economy has been a remarkably unique model, right? There's a lot of reasons why countries around the world, if we're sort of talking about this ideological tug of war between the US model and the Chinese model, or the US-led order and the Chinese-led order, a lot of countries have looked at the Chinese model and thought, well, maybe democracy isn't so good because our economy is very erratic. We have different people coming in office who have different ideas. That disrupts the policies that, Trump undoes all the things that Biden did. Biden reinstates what he did, et cetera, et cetera. Versus the Chinese have one party and they keep doing the same thing. And it leads to very consistent growth. Yes, people have less freedoms, but maybe that's the trade-off that they're welcoming. So it's these kinds of things that I think play into mindsets of people. However, obviously China isn't in a vacuum. They're highly dependent on trade. And in the past, even couple months, there's been growing evidence to suggest that China is really struggling to sustain what it's been used to, which is very high growth rates. China was used to, up until, I think, pre-COVID, double rates of growth, right? 10%. For comparison, if the UK economy has 3% year growth, that's considered really good, right? Advanced economies doing 3-4% is considered pretty good, but developing economies, it's not. It's not great at all. So China's ability to sustain this rate of growth has been slowing. And whilst a lot of people point to the 100 million people that were brought out of poverty, yes, that is true. But that is not only because of the internal policies of the government. It was because of globalization. It was because of China opening up into the international system. It was because of joining WTO. All these changes that led to the liberalization of the economics, but not the political element. So now China is having to face the fact that it is an advanced economy. During my time in the World Bank, there was a large array of discussion and debate around, China is no longer a middle-income country, it is an upper-income country, and therefore it should be held to giving more provision of aid or support, right? Investing instead of being a dominant recipient. And then we have to talk about the housing bubble. You'll see plenty of videos on YouTube, of course, which claim that China's on its moment of imminent collapse, which is complete absurdity. You and I talk about, obviously, the imminent collapse of Russia because of the war, but it's not happening yet. It could come, right? The ultimate collapse sort of thing. It's a slow-moving car crash. It's a slow-burning model. But the point with China is that this system has worked but it's not going to be workable forever because of the demographics, because of the changing shape of the international economy. China has benefited very much from globalization, free trade, uninterrupted freedom of goods, all that sort of information, all that sort of stuff. But as the world becomes more fragmented, more regionalized, if you like, because of many reasons, but partially Trump, that is not beneficial for China's situation. So they're having to look at reforming quite a lot of their internal expenditure. We saw a purge in January of the most senior general of the PLA, which is a big deal. It kind of went under the radar because of Venezuela. But yeah, I think it's just to land the plane. I would just say it's not sustainable. It's not like on a precipice and it's about to collapse, but certainly China faces structural issues, right? If it wants to be a reserve currency, which would greatly benefit the economy longer term, it has to have an open capital account. It has to take steps to become more like the Americans, right? This whole idea that they can replace the dollar or that they can have a SWIFT equivalent or what's known as kits. It's not possible unless the Chinese make these structural economic changes.
Thank you very much. Fantastic answer. Just, I'd like to add to that. You mentioned that when we talk about Russia and Russian collapse, then collapse is not happening overnight. It's going slowly. Well, it is happening overnight. It has happened. Federal employees do not get paid any longer. Roads do not get fixed. Public transportation buses do not go. Not everywhere, but the troubles. Okay, so it has collapsed. This is just the beginning of the collapse, but Russia has stopped functioning normally. And in Moscow, for 7 days now, they haven't had internet. Okay, rumors going wild. Most likely what's happening is Putin is very afraid of military coup, and he's shut down the communications. Well, anyway, Russia is, I would say it has collapsed, and then we're seeing the collapse. And 2026 is going to be very, very interesting. So let's move to another.
And if I can just, no, do you mind if I to comment here for not for sale? China's not looking to make the renminbi the next reserve currency. Well, it kind of goes back to what we discussed earlier, which is what does China want? Do they want to be a global rival for the United States, or do they just want to be a beneficiary of it? And I think that there is evidence to suggest that Xi Jinping has aspirations to create a more welcoming system, like this whole idea of BRICS, this whole idea of an alternative financial model. These all require significant changes to domestic Chinese economic policy, which, yeah, they may well not want to make it the reserve currency, but if they want to decouple, right? China and Russia right now increasingly trade on a bilateral thing through their own currencies, through the ruble and the renminbi, right? But if they want to make that more comprehensive, leverage BRICS or whatever, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have to make these considerations. I'm not claiming that they want to be the reserve currency. I'm just emphasizing that these are the kinds of things that they might have to do if they want to.
Okay.
Anyway.
Thank you. Could China hire Russian women to work in their factories? It could, in theory, but why?
I mean, that's not a angle I've ever considered before.
I've never heard anything like that.
No, it certainly, your audience has a very exotic set of ideas, but I'm not sure that's one that would play into the long-term strategic value of either country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a question from Amir, one of the mods of the channel. What role does China play in the technology sector? For example, silicon chips, etc. And how would China benefit from Russia in this realm? Pyotr?
Well, China has one of the largest crypto mining areas. It's not necessarily legal, but it is pretty evident that exists. There's another reason why they're very interested in Taiwan, obviously, semiconductors and TSMC. the largest producer, about 80%. So the semiconductors are what goes in your phone, controls much of our basic electrical equipment. So if China, in theory, can control Taiwan or absorb Taiwan or whatever it is, they can control 75, 80% of semiconductor supply and hold the world to ransom. And this is why you see the Americans, the Dutch, the Japanese, especially in the past couple of years, working on agreeing a way to limit Chinese access to advanced tech. So China is very good at copying others, but they're not necessarily the best sometimes at innovating. So if you look at certain cars or military equipment, often enough it's been seen as a bit of a rip-off. Top Gear did this. It's a British program from the UK, but they 15 years ago now, but it's the one that comes to mind in my head. They went to China to look at the car market, and so many of the cars that they showcased were literally just rip-offs of Western models. Now, of course, though, China has taken those, reverse engineered, and begins to learn and innovate a little bit more. And so some of the biggest car models that you'll find driving around here in London, where I am at least at the moment, or increasingly in parts of Europe, are of a Chinese make, origin. So China is definitely growing in the EV sector. Their EV market is huge. Their general influence or input towards renewables and these sorts of areas is huge. But then, as we saw, people remember at the beginning of 2025, around a year ago, when DeepSeek, the one with the whale, the AI DeepSeek came out, right? Everyone was freaking out because they were like, oh my God, this AI has come out of nowhere and it is incredibly influential. It has, methods and algorithm and understanding in a way that ChatGPT just doesn't. It's largely disappeared because it was a bit of a too good to be true story. It looks very good on the surface, but then you begin to scratch beneath it, and it was really quite limited, or it was so biased because of the Chinese because of the government. You wanted to ask it about sensitive questions, and it would give you a limited answer, a non-existent answer, because it wasn't allowed to. So it depends on the type of industry that you're talking about.
I will give you and everyone a couple personal stories with the Chinese. Now, first one is a very old story. It didn't happen to me, but I heard it from a guy who it happened to. Now, I started working in Russia's energy sector in 2004, and I was placed in charge of supervising a manufacturing plant in Ukraine, Zaporizhia, Ukraine, power electronics. The преобразователь, that's basically power electronics. Those high voltage rectifiers, okay? And plant wasn't doing too well. We bought it on the cheap, and we were trying to revive it. And obviously we needed investments, we needed fresh blood, we needed new ideas, okay? And we needed a big sales team. So that came from Moscow, and I was trying to get the plant going, because plant was in a state of near death, okay? So obviously I knew the executives at the plant, and I was having a drink with... It was either chief engineer or chief constructor. I don't remember which one is that. Chief engineer was in charge of actually manufacturing, and chief constructor was in charge of designing new power transformer units, rectifiers, and so forth. So I think it was the guy who was designing the technology. So they told me a story. Now, remember, that's 2004. So they told me a story that when the USSR fell apart, that plant was one of the leading plants for Russian power transformer units. Because it used to be one plant producing both rectifiers and power transformers, and they were, it was two different pieces of equipment, but there was one unit, okay? And basically it was one plant, and the new owners, they privatized this plant, and they basically put a brick wall right in the middle of a plant, and they divided, okay, this part is one plant, the rectifiers, and this plant is transformers, right? So now, these guys that I knew, that I worked with and supervised, they were the rectifiers, the rectifying unit. And basically, that everything died. Their sales died, and they were trying to survive. They didn't have any money. They didn't pay wages to salaries to workers for months and months because there's no sales. And he said about mid-90s, 94, something like that, the Chinese came. And they offered to create joint venture with the plant. And the plant's part was to provide the technology that Chinese didn't have, and the Chinese would give money. The financial part would be covered by them. They said, we're going to give you $1 million, and we need you to take the blueprints, basically your know-how, your technology, and together we will build a plant in China. And then you will own half of it, because we're joint venture, 50-50. Okay, and that $1 million that we're going to give to you in Ukraine, that's for you to, cover the expenses of the plant and so forth. Then we're going to invest all the money in China, and we're going to build wonderful rectifying units based on your technology. We're going to sell them in China. We're going to split the money. Perfect. So the guy said, well, it was too good to be true. And said, like, $100 back then was a good salary. And then the Chinese offered us $1 million. So, and they thought that was too good to be true. But you know what? The Chinese did transfer $1 million. They meant business. And oh my God, he said the entire plant was celebrating for, weeks and weeks because everyone got paid. And of course, all the executives got their chunks, okay? And then they started stealing that $1 million. And not stealing, but like spending it, you know what I mean? And the Chinese invited those two top guys, the chief engineer and chief constructor, to China. He said, we're going to place you in China. You're going to supervise the construction of a new plant based on your technology, blueprints, on your product. And we're going to pay you good salary. It's like $2,000 per month. But then you're going to transfer know-how. You're going to teach our guys how to create the power transformer, the rectifier units. And again, it was too good to be true. And the Chinese did fly them to China, gave them housing, fed them, and paid them for 8 months or something like that. They paid them good salary. And they built a plant based, and the product was that the rectifying unit that was designed in the USSR and was built in the USSR and then later in Ukraine. And then for 1 year, the Chinese were honoring their agreement. They're saying, okay, we are building this rectifying unit, and then you supervise the construction, all of that, and we're going to sell them to the Chinese market. And after about 1 year, they came back and they said, you know what, not working. Why? Well, we can't sell any rectifying. There's no market. We made a big mistake. It's a strategic mistake. Your product does not fit China. No one buys it. Okay? And the Ukrainian guys, they got scared. It's like, well, we don't have the $1 million anymore. We can't give you back. And the Chinese said, well, we understand, but it's us. We made the mistake. So you keep the money, and we'll just call it quits. And the Ukrainians like, oh, okay. And they called it quits. Well, turns out that they were a few, not just one, but a few large construction plants for rectifying units built next to the plant that the Ukrainians knew about. Okay, and that rectifying unit was upgraded, transformed, but the core technology was Ukrainian from Zaporizhia. And the Chinese were building hundreds every year. Okay, and now they did the same thing with the power transformers. And they are building world-class power transformer units, and they flooded the entire China but that core technology came from Zaporizhia that they bought for $1 million back in like 1995. So that's the story how Chinese, well, basically, they didn't steal it, okay, but that, I don't even know how to call it. And the guy we were drinking with the guy, okay, and he was older guy, and he was telling me the story, and he said, you know what, we'll understand that they didn't do a good thing to us, okay, they lied to us, but we, even now, he was saying in 2004, we don't know how to call what they did to us, okay. So they gave them money, and a few people bought apartments and I don't know, land or whatever. They got dividends, but the Chinese have benefited immensely. They didn't steal the technology, but they transferred it to China in a very smart and a very cheap way. Okay, that's the first-hand experience. And the second story, and I'll be very, very quick. That's fast forward to 2017. 2018 perhaps. You know, I'm in charge of a large construction company. We build in power facilities in different countries, and I had a very large network of people in the industry, right? And one of my friends, well, acquaintances who I had known very well, she called me up and said, "Look, I have a Chinese woman here, a representative of a Chinese province. She would like to meet you and a shareholder of the company." And, you know, we did some moving time around and we scheduled the meeting. And the lady from China, the official representative of a Chinese province, showed up. And she was very unpunctual. She was late, about 20 minutes, which was... I don't know much about Chinese culture, but anyway, and we started talking about how we can do business together. We have any interests, if we had any interests. And then basically she cut the conversation short and she said, "Look, I am here, I represent the Chinese government in Moscow and some, like the province somewhere in the south, I forgot which one. And she said, I have a proposition for you. We need very smart people in China. We're willing to treat them very well. We're willing to pay them lots of money, good salaries, give them housing, and basically all they need to do is to work in China. We need engineers, we need people with high education with certain degrees, academicians, you know, professors, that's great. So for each person, if you hunt and, you know, give us information and sell this person to us, well, convince person to go to China, we'll give you like, I don't know, $15,000 personally to you." And I was like, what? Did you come here to discuss, you know, perhaps a project of power facility construction in Russia, or perhaps you want to sell something? She goes, no, I just want your people. I said, well, are you going to enslave them in China? Will they be able to come back at will? She goes, okay, they wouldn't want to because we're going to give them lots of money. And they're not going to do anything, but they're going to work along our engineers and just work together and share their experience, share their knowledge, and they're going to pay it handsomely. Why would they want to leave and go back to Russia? You know, that's not going to happen. So basically, and she gave us... 15, 20, 25, depending on like what kind of the degree person had. I was absolutely amazed. They were doing, I don't even know, like head hunting? Is this people hunting? I don't know how to call it in English. Well, that was my second experience with the Chinese. So she could care less about our company, could care less about what we could offer. And we tried to work with large Chinese corporations, CMEC. They looked at us like we were specks of dust. Okay? They looked at us like a Russian market is this tiny little thing. If we wanted to, we could come in and we could rebuild your country in 2 weeks. That type of attitude. Yeah, I never worked with Chinese. We tried to work with CMC, but two different mentalities, and we couldn't do anything with them. So anyway, sorry, I've taken some time. That's my personal experience of working with Chinese people and Chinese companies.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of my father's experiences when he did a lot of work in Kazakhstan. He's had to deal with the Chinese a few times, and he's always said that they're very shifty. They're very good at saying one thing, but then subtly implying another or doing something completely different. I think a word that would suit well in one of your stories is siphoned. They siphoned off.
Siphon, yes.
It's a good word to describe, that they didn't, well, there was a manipulation, but they did pay you, but it was paying, the net worth of what they got was far higher than what they actually paid for, right? So, yeah, it's certainly, I think when it comes to technology, ultimately, the Chinese are very good at imitating, and ultimately then reverse engineering and developing their own. But if it's a completely new kind of industry, like quantum mechanics or quantum computing, Chinese were a long way behind, and that's why they are making inroads, but they're still quite a while away, and why, regardless of left or right, Democrat or Republican, there's been a universal effort by the United States specifically to limit their access to advanced materials and tech. So yeah, no, I mean, the situation with China, but they think very differently. They think I don't know, there's this debate, the Chinese thinking decades whilst everyone else thinks in years. I think that might be slightly overblown, but certainly that's why China is where it is and why it's such an integral part of our dynamics and the relationship with Russia. But
Skolzer just posted, they pull a bait and switch approach, and that I totally understand and agree. That's bait and switch. I was trying to sign a cooperation agreement with the Chinese for like 3 months, and we were discussing this thick agreement, a contract draft, and we spent so much time going over, changing things, and then sending to the Chinese side, and then they would get back there, and then it was just taking forever. I mean, to us, the contract, that's, you sign it and that's a done deal. You go according to the contract, and they weren't signing it. They kept on stalling, and we just, jumped on the plane and we flew to the head HQ, and we just confronted the guys. And the big boss sitting there goes, well, I really don't need you. So they were, using this 3 months of just baiting and switching. That's perfect example. Can't trust them. Okay, they have their own interests, and that's what dominates the Chinese. They operate a different operation system from us. At least they were operating different system from Russians.
And that's why throughout all we've said tonight, some people might disagree or think that I've said some things that weren't that accurate. I'm not pretending to be an intricate expert of everything Chinese, and I'm not pretending to be. There's a really good the former prime minister of Australia. He is it Kenneth Waltz? No. Let me see what his name is. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. If people want a good illustration of an expert, a Westerner who is really well known for being accurate, even the Chinese recognize his accuracy, Kevin Rudd he's the former Prime Minister of Australia, but I've done a lot listening to him. But I think it's more about, I try to focus and understand China's strategies in the context of geoeconomics, geopolitics, and its relationships with others. So that's but there's a lot to we can talk about indefinitely.
Okay, Pyotr, I really wish we could continue, but we have a time limit, and the moderators have done a fantastic job helping us keep this live stream clean and pleasant. Thank you very much for joining me at my channel. It's such a great change, and let's continue, talking, discussing China, perhaps other geopolitical events. We have the huge event in the Middle East happening right now. I try to cover as much as I can, but it's so huge that you need really dozens of sessions to cover everything that is going on of significance there. I personally have enjoyed our conversation here. I would like to do that again sometimes. So I suggest we come back sometimes and speak again.
I see Rob from County Kent. Well, I'm coming to you from London, but I'm from Sussex, Rob. So hope the Garden of England is looking good. No, absolutely, Constantine. I think we're due for our monthly Russian collaboration, right? We have you on a monthly basis to talk about the Russian economy explicitly, have your reflections on the war front as well, or Putin's mindset and relationship to the war. So we should probably aim to do that next week for people who are interested, to come and join us. We don't do live streams as we do pre-recorded, but maybe we should do live streams as well. And yes, I'd love to join you again. I'm very honored that you picked me as your inaugural guest. I think we should talk about Russia, Europe, Russia, England, Russia, Africa. I think there's a lot of things we talk about. Certainly the Russia-Chinese relationship is a good one to start with. I had a great time. So I hope everyone else did, and see you soon.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Again, mods, the pillars of Inside Russia, the gems, and the usual suspects, thank you for coming. And we'll see you soon.